A bit of a sensitive one today because I want to talk about the awful events of yesterday in Manchester and what happened at the synagogue. Um, and especially that it's now transpired that unfortunately two of the innocent people in that building were actually shot by the police, one fatally. So the first thing I want to say is my heart goes out both to the victims but also the officers involved in this. Now, I'll just come on to what the legal implications are, because that's what I want to talk about. But one thing that I've noticed is that the IOPC, the Independent Office of Police Complaints, they have a duty whenever there is a police-related fatality to open an investigation, and they have done. But they've taken the unusual step of saying that they are treating the officers as witnesses, not suspects. So hopefully that will provide some comfort to them, because you know these things drag on for years, and that poor officer or officers, they now have this hanging over them, and no doubt they will fall awful. I mean, I know a lot of people who do this. I mean, I've spoken before about how I used to actually lecture to the firearms police, and they are very dedicated professional people. And I guarantee you that nobody is feeling more awful about this than the officers involved, not just for their own sakes, but for what's actually happened. Because, they volunteer without any extra pay to put themselves quite literally in the line of fire to protect people. When you actually look at the statistics for police shootings, they are remarkably low. So these are not gung-ho, sort of trigger-happy people or anything. But anyway, what actually happens legally in this sort of situation? Well, obviously, the police are allowed to use force, including lethal force, for the protection of themselves or for other people, as indeed anybody is, Section 3 of the Criminal Law Act. But what actually happens here where you hit an innocent person? Who's responsible as a matter of law? Well, interestingly, it's actually the original suspect, and that's from a case called Crown and Paget. This is a case back in the 80s, 1981. There was a guy who basically, it was a DV situation, and he held his ex-partner hostage. He was using her as a human shield because he had a shotgun. And obviously armed police turned up, but then he went out, all guns blazing, as it were. He started shooting at the police. The police shot back, but they hit his ex-partner, who I believe was pregnant at the time. So what happened? Well, Paget was actually prosecuted for murder because they said, well, look, you have effectively used this person as a human shield, and therefore this is your fault. Now, the jury actually convicted of manslaughter. They acquitted of murder, but they convicted of manslaughter. Paget appealed that, but his appeal was knocked back. And the court said you just apply the standard manslaughter test. That's what you keep it very simple. You say to the jury, the definition of manslaughter is you commit an unlawful act that causes the death of another person. So the issue here is causation. Now, it doesn't have to be the sole cause, but it has to be sort of the operating cause. It has to be a significant factor. And we apply something called the but-for test. But for what you had done, would this have actually happened? I mean, the but-for test has been criticised because it's very wide. But for you leaving the house this morning, this wouldn't have happened. But for you sort of putting on your jacket and going to work. But what they say is, no, you look at the actual facts around the actual incident at the time. And but for the actions of Mr. Paget, would his ex-partner still be alive? Yes, she would. But the defence tried to argue what we call a novus actus interveniens, an intervening act. Because that is where somebody does something that does cause a risk or injures somebody or puts them at risk of harm. But then something else intervenes, and that then becomes the operating cause. The classic example is, if you injure somebody and they are taken to hospital, but the actually cause of death is negligent medical treatment, whose fault is it there? Well, actually, it's still your fault because it's seen that negligent medical treatment is a foreseeable consequence of you putting somebody, causing harm to somebody that requires medical treatment. But say, for instance, they were on their way to the hospital in the ambulance and some reckless driver hit the ambulance, and that's what actually took you out. Well, in that case, that would be regarded as an intervening act. I mean, there's all sorts of cases on this. There's lots of cases of people dropping people off stretchers in the military for some reason. Where people have minor injuries and then fall off a stretcher and get serious head injury. And they said, well, again, it's just no, incompetent medical treatment is something foreseeable. So in this particular case, they said this is not an intervening act, because it's reasonably foreseeable that if you basically engage in criminal conduct and start shooting at people, the police might start shooting back, and therefore it's all on you. So in this particular case, I mean, obviously the guy himself now is out of the picture. But as a matter of law, it could be argued that he personally would be criminally liable, and had he survived, he probably would have been prosecuted for murder and stroke manslaughter. I mean, they could certainly get home on the manslaughter case. The murder one is slightly different because the mens rea, the state of mind for murder, is you intend that somebody should suffer death or serious harm. And again, intention can be just the reasonably foreseeable consequences of your voluntary actions. There are cases to say that. I mean, there was a classic one of somebody throwing a concrete block off a motorway bridge to scare a taxi driver, but they actually dropped the rock went through the windscreen. And they said, well, no, we were just trying to scare him. And they said, no, because you should have foreseen that you put somebody at risk. I mean, this actually also cropped up. Remember those daft kids throwing the thing off in the shopping mall? Where they threw the furniture off, and luckily they didn't hit anybody, so they were just prosecuted with criminal damage, but with the likelihood of causing harm. It's the nearest we have to reckless endangerment. But yeah, in this particular case, the officers are almost certainly in the clear. I don't want to sort of prejudge the inquiry, but it seems to me that it's very difficult to sort of fault their actions. I mean, ironically, for poor old Jewish people, I mean, this is not new. I mean, have a look at what happened in Entebbe. That was the same thing. They managed to come in, somebody stood up celebrating, cheering, but they'd said get down, and when they see somebody stand up, it's unfortunately you've got to make these decisions in a split second. So there's nothing particularly new here. What's the flip side of this? Just to sort of give you both sides of this. What if you actually are trying to hurt somebody and you actually get somebody else? Say you wish to shoot somebody, and and it's like, yeah, I want to shoot that person, and you've got no justification, it's just a crime, but you miss, and you hit sort of like the person behind them, just an innocent bystander who no beef with, didn't even know. Well, what happens there? Well, it's something called transfer of malice. Because the argument is, yes, you have to have the intention to kill or cause serious harm, but it doesn't have to be against a particular person. If you intend that ill will towards one person, but through your incompetence you actually end up taking out another person, they transfer the mens rea. And this is yet another use of the word malice in law. I think this is about the fourth definition now, isn't it? But we call it transfer of malice, and say the intention you had against that person can be transferred to the other person, even though you didn't even know that person existed and had no grief with them. But there you go. I mean, I'll keep monitoring this. I think it's just sad for all concerned. And like I say, actually, my heart goes out for the victims especially. But yeah, I think also for the officers, because they must be feeling absolutely devastated about this. But there you go. As always, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely informative, and I would say vaguely accurate. But that is actually the law. I mean, if you want to look up yourself, it's Crown and Paget, England and Wales Court of Appeal, Criminal Division. There's quite a lot of write-ups about it as well, because it's sort of a very, very key case, both for law students and just for the practice of law generally.